I'm so thrilled to be here at Berkeley with you wonderful graduates and your terrific families. And honored especially because in being the commencement speaker, I succeed last year. My pal and Times colleague, David Carr, was here to give a great talk. And yeah, it is a real tragedy for our profession to have him removed from the field so suddenly and sadly. Most commencement speakers try to be inspirational by talking about a trial that they had to overcome. At Stanford, Steve Jobs was so eloquent talking about how getting fired at Macintosh turned out to be an important positive turning point in his life. Conan O'Brien was riveting, talking at Dartmouth about what it was like to be fired by The Tonight Show. And about a year ago, I usually like to give one commencement speech, and I was beginning to prepare my thoughts for giving a commencement speech at Wake Forest. And I was really worried because I didn't have any kind of dramatic material like that. Then I got my wish. So it's been a year since I was fired as executive editor of The Times. I've spent the year teaching a creative writing class, Introduction to Journalism, at Harvard in their English department, and beginning the reporting and research on a book I'm writing about this challenging dynamic period in journalism and where the news is going. So what can I tell you I've learned in the last year that might be helpful to you as you start or continue your careers? First, like some of the other speakers you've heard from, I am incredibly optimistic about narrative long-form stories. If you are the kind of reporter who digs and goes out in the world to bear witness, and then can weave that reporting into a gripping and yes, long narrative, your talents, either print or visual, have never been more in demand or more valuable. But everyone is saying that with the dominance of mobile technology, everything has to be short, tight as a few swipes. Don't believe it. Look at some recent high-impact stories that went viral. There was the two-part series just recently in the New York Times about nail salons and the abusive labor practices behind them. That story, that was reported by an incredibly scrappy young female reporter named Sarah Neer, was translated into 3 languages, Korean, Chinese, and Spanish. It was 2 full parts with ambitious graphics that were loaded with information. The stories just went completely viral. Look at the immense popularity of Serial, which has helped, as others mentioned, stoke a true renaissance in podcasting. After the first episode premiered on This American Life, it took only 1 more for the audience to exceed 1 million. Several weeks later, it was 3 million. Telling a gripping criminal justice story in 12 one-hour episodes really wasn't so new. It's really as old as Dickens, when Londoners would wait on the docks for the latest chapters of The Old Curiosity Shop, which was published as a serial novel. They had to know, was Little Nell going to be okay? There is a human need and want for the well-told narrative. And you now find wonderful examples of this kind of work all over the web, not just in traditional newspapers, magazines, or on NPR. BuzzFeed has a staff of 15 full-time investigative journalists. Sure, investigative reporting isn't where BuzzFeed earns most of its money. It's those adorable puppy listicles that draw the advertising. But they've been publishing some really great stuff. An investigation of how battered women are going to jail for longer terms than their abusers because of rather obscure but unfair state failure to protect laws. Recently, a young BuzzFeed reporter, Ellie Hall, found and interviewed an Alabama woman who'd gone to Syria to join ISIS, showing real enterprise. Jonah Peretti, BuzzFeed's founder, recently wrote, "It feels like we're at the start of another formative era of media history, where iconic companies will emerge and thrive for many decades. I certainly hope so." Columbia Journalism School's top documentary student this year actually ended up turning down a job offer from Frontline to go to Vice Media. They are going, as their motto goes, to places on the edge to tell stories that are overlooked by the traditional networks, and they've succeeded in drawing a whole new, younger audience. Recently, I was emailing with an old Times colleague, Jeff Girth, a legend in investigative reporting. I asked him in the email if he'd written anything recently that he was proud of, and he sent me a link to Gawker. Jeff Girth, long form in Gawker. It was a great story about campaign finance. Narrative is marketable. My fingers are crossed on that. Steve Brill and I are trying to launch a long-form startup, and we've come close to reaching deals with several partners, and we still very much hope to get off the ground. Starting up a startup takes longer than I would have thought to start up, I'm afraid to say. What about the business model? You can't come to a journalism school and not talk about that. The landscape keeps changing, and as everyone else said today, you can depend on one thing: it's going to keep changing. Depend on that and be adaptable. Most of you can't expect to go to one news organization and work there for the rest of your careers. Some of you may actually get fired. And if that happens, be resilient. Keep chasing stories. Keep up your passion for digging. That's what's pulled me through. But I think that basically the outlook is more stable than it has been in recent years. The era of endless cutting of newsrooms seems to be over. And it's true that perhaps the people being hired are being hired for specialties like audience development. But I think in general, the situation is brighter in newsrooms. It's not stable, but there's reason for hope. And I agree with Clay Shirky and Marty Barron, the editor of the Washington Post, who recently gave a great speech in California. It's time to stop mourning the past and what's been lost. And there's no single magic bullet answer to the business model. It may be lots of little innovations, not one big idea, that keeps quality journalism healthy. I spent last Friday with Emily Bell at the Toast Center on Technology at Columbia Journalism School, and we were discussing the ramifications of Facebook's hosting news stories from the New York Times, BuzzFeed, NBC, and a few other places. Whenever there's a large development like this, we are all tempted to see it as a transformative moment. And surely this is an important one. I don't think many of us traditional news editors saw the importance of social media platforms and how hyper-distribution would transform our work. Now some say Facebook wants to be the whole internet, and that its algorithms will make the work of editors as outmoded as milliners became in the last century. I don't think so. By the way, my grandfather was a milliner. And he went to his grave saying, "Ladies will always wear hats." Journalists have always been the crucial filters. That is what we do all day. This is a story. That's not a story. This filtering called editorial judgment is what gives our work such value. When time is so compressed and mass distribution is instant, your role as the filterers and caretakers of journalistic ethics and values becomes even more crucial and valuable. We can't assume that giant tech companies understand and share our journalistic values. They weren't around when the New York Times had to make the tough and brave judgment to publish the Pentagon Papers. When so much private digital correspondence can be hacked and instantly uploaded, who decides what's newsworthy or publishable? The tech companies have been geniuses at making things work better, but now their industry is increasingly our industry. So it's vital that we develop shared values about how to keep the public informed. What else do I worry about? The shocking lack of diversity in newsrooms, despite some of the wins that Ed mentioned in his interview of me, of some women editors at newspapers. Actually, in a very large gender study done by the Neiman Foundation, the number of women in leadership roles across newsrooms in our country has gone down. And it wasn't way up there to begin with. And it isn't just gender diversity, it's all kinds of diversity. And you've seen it in the coverage of major stories involving police violence, Ferguson, et cetera. That our newsrooms do not reflect the composition of our country. And I tried very hard. That was a point of passion for me when I was both managing editor and executive editor of the Times. And I really implore you graduates, keep up that fight in the newsrooms when you get there. It's vitally important for the health of journalism and for the public to really be informed of the stories that matter most. I also worry that there is too little investigative journalism focused on the tremendous concentration of corporate power. Yes, government abuse is an important target, but I don't see enough Lowell Bergmans out there taking on huge corporate interests. The stories I was most proud of when I was executive editor at the Times were deep looks at the Apple economy and its labor conditions. David Barboza's work on the corruption of the Chinese princelings, and David Barstow on how Walmart bribed to become the largest marketer in Mexico. I don't want to paint with too broad a brush. Some of the work, including one of the Times Pulitzers, was classic holding corporate power accountable, but I just don't see enough of that work. It takes a long time. It's difficult. The layers of PR people and Oppo researchers that surround the biggest companies in our country, you can't imagine what trying to pierce through those layers of protection are, but it's a high calling, and that work has never been more important. I feel that there should be more of it. In our newsrooms, I worry that marketing is preoccupying too many newsroom leaders, where metrics will govern which stories get the most prominence, where corporate sponsors are being asked to underwrite live news events like conferences, and where branded advertising studios filled with writers live right next door to the journalists. Sure, in a digital world, the lines between business, technology, design, and news are blurrier. But a wall between news and advertisers still has to exist. And I'll close with a little story from the past. In the 1950s, GM pulled its advertising from the Wall Street Journal because it was unhappy with some of its stories. And believe it or not, the paper's pro-capitalist, conservative, arch-conservative editorial page struck back with a marvelous editorial called A Difference of Opinion. It was a watershed moment for journalistic integrity. Our business is publishing information, not withholding it, the journal wrote. that a company happily chooses to advertise with us cannot be allowed to put the newspaper under any obligation to the advertiser. That's still core to our values. So go forth, you terrific graduates, and tell some stories. Thank you.